Hello, welcome to our The Word on Fire Institute family, and welcome to all of you joining us on YouTube Live. I am Joshua Bidding, Assistant Director of the Word on Fire Institute here in Rochester, Minnesota. Welcome to Evangelization and Culture Live, our monthly 3-day live seminar on a topic at the crossroads of faith and culture. We are delighted to have with us in studio today Mark Bradford, our Word on Fire Fellow for Persons with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Mark will give a 3-part lecture, 3 Threats to the Disabled and What We Can Do About It. Day 1 today is on the new eugenics and our obsession with perfection. We are dual streaming today's presentation on the Institute platform and on YouTube. For those of you viewing from the Institute platform, please open up the chat icon below the screen and introduce yourself, who you are, and where you're joining us from. And as we begin, please start typing in your questions and comments, which we'll be getting to in the second half of today's presentation. To those of you watching on YouTube, please also be encouraged to do the same. We want to invite everybody watching on YouTube to consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. I'll say more about this at the end. Without further ado, let's get to Mark Bradford on the new eugenics and our obsession with perfection. Class is in session.
Thank you very much, Joshua. And just a hearty welcome to you. You're fairly new here with the Word on Fire Institute, and many of us were praying that God would send Matthew Petrusik some help because he had so much to do here. So it's great to be here with you and to be able to welcome you to the Institute. And it's good to be in Rochester, even in very cold weather in the wintertime, almost wintertime. So as Joshua said, this presentation will be talking over the next 3 days about various threats that people with disabilities can encounter that come to us from the culture that we currently live in, which is challenging for many of us in various ways, but there's some particular ways where those challenges impact people with disabilities more substantially. So the way that the 3 days will break down is this. Today, as Joshua mentioned, we'll be talking about the new eugenics and our quest for perfection and what that means for people with disabilities. But just to give an overview of the next 2 days as well, for those of you who are on YouTube, these are seminars for people who are members of the Word on Fire Institute. Joshua will talk more about this at the end, but you're welcome to join us today. Very glad that you're here. And also there is a way that you'll be able to participate in the next 2 days if you should choose to. So tomorrow we'll be talking about sexual rights and healthy attitudes in relationships and how our current culture's attitudes towards sexuality and the idea that we have sexual rights impacts people with disabilities in an especially profound and damaging way. And then these two things can work together to create the third threat that we'll talk about on Wednesday. And that's the mental health crisis that everyone acknowledges that our country is in, with rates of depression and anxiety and various other mental disorders and disturbances coming about because of the various factors, but the confusion of the culture, the state of the world. We're constantly hearing about wars, and just today in the news, they were mentioning just before this began that we've been asked to pray for the church in Syria. Christians are now being attacked in Aleppo with an invasion of Islamic insurgents that just has happened over the weekend. So we all need to keep them in mind and in prayer as well. But we'll be talking about disability and mental health and how the church can be a pathway to healing in that. So today, again, we're talking about the new eugenics and our obsession with perfection. And we have to start somewhere because eugenics has a long history in the history of the world. We can go back to Plato's Republic and we can see that Asclepius, who was the god of medicine and healing, Plato said that he would not treat people whose habits rendered them incapable of living, since treating them did no good either for the patients themselves or for the state. So we can see even a very sort of utilitarian idea of the person way back in 4th century or so Greece. But we have to bring it to the present in some sort of way. And so we're going to the United States in the early part of the 20th century, and we're starting here with a Supreme Court case called Buck versus Bell that was decided by the United States Supreme Court in 1927. And that decision was written by who was considered to be the brightest legal mind of his time, and is still, I think, one of the more quoted Supreme Court justices within our history, and that's Oliver Wendell Holmes. And this is a picture of him. You can see very typifies the time visually. I think is very helpful for us to sort of get an idea that in the 1920s, even before, there was a very strong eugenics movement going on in the United States. In 1924, there was a bill passed in Virginia called the Virginia Eugenical Sterilization Act that wasn't repealed actually until 1974. But it claimed that individuals who were confined to state institutions and were afflicted with hereditary forms of insanity that were recurrent, idiocy, imbecility, feeble-mindedness, or epilepsy could be sterilized, could be legally sterilized within the law. So this case of Buck versus Bell came to the Supreme Court. Some believe was really forced to the Supreme Court for a decision on this to allow a legal approval of the process. And that case involved a young woman named Carrie Buck, whose mother, Emma, had been declared an imbecile before her. And Carrie, likewise, was then left alone since her mother had been institutionalized and was taken in by a family that had her in school, used her more as a housemaid than bring her in as a member of the family, from what I've read about the situation anyway. And eventually Carrie became pregnant, claimed that she had been raped by a family member of the family that was toasting her, that she was living with. But the family then sought to have her institutionalized as well and claimed imbecility or idiocy, as it was sometimes called at the same time for her. So this is the case that came to the Supreme Court in Buck versus Bell. And this is where this legendary phrase of Oliver Wendell Holmes has come from: 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Carrie was the second generation, and she had given birth to this child that she had become pregnant by, or with rather. And it was thought that that child as well would be an imbecile. And so those are the 3 generations of imbeciles, to quote Oliver Wendell Holmes. And we have to realize we're in the 1920s, the words imbeciles and idiocy had some sort of legal understanding at that point in time. We're very sensitive to that language now, but that wasn't the case in the 1920s. So the case was decided positively. There was only one abstaining, or one negative opinion. Only one person voted against this, and that was Pierce Butler, who was the only Catholic on the Supreme Court at the time. And thankfully, he voiced his opposition to the decision that was made, but he did not write an opinion to support that. Actually, Holmes' full quote is quite chilling, and I'll read it for you here. He said, "Instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." So that's Oliver Wendell Holmes. And this is Carrie Buck with her mother, Emma. This picture is from 1924. Emma was diagnosed as feeble-minded in 1920, as I said before, not because of any medical findings, but she, like her daughter Carrie, was considered to be promiscuous, and she was institutionalized for that reason. Carrie herself was taken out of school when she was in the 6th grade, so she wasn't able even to finish her education. But everything prior to that time indicated that she was successful in school, or at least performed satisfactorily in school. But again, because of becoming pregnant and because of the family's embarrassment, many presume, over the pregnancy, she was also institutionalized and became a test case, rather, for Virginia's law. Virginia's law resulted in the sterilization of some 8,300 individuals in Virginia that were institutionalized. And nationwide, as other states picked up after the Supreme Court decision authorizing this barbaric practice, it's estimated that about 70,000 individuals, both men and women, were sterilized as a consequence of being institutionalized, and for the negative eugenic effect of not wanting to perpetuate any sense of incompetence or again, to use the language of the time, which is really hard to use because they were imbeciles or idiots, as they were called at the time. Horrible situation. So let's move forward from 1927 into the present day. And this is the here and now. And this is a couple that has become somewhat well known in certain circles. This is Simone and Malcolm Collins, and they live not too far from where my family lives, in the suburbs of Philadelphia. They live in Audubon, Pennsylvania. And they are called, in this article from Business Insider, the hipster eugenicists. They are leading a group of people that are called pronatalists, people who are in favor of births because they look at the population situation in the United States and across the Western world and realize that the population is declining and that there needs to be something to restore the population, or we're going to eventually have fewer and fewer children and dwindle in population. We won't be able to support the social services we need, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they started this pronatalist movement. And the pronatalist movement is a movement to try to encourage people to have children, which is a great thing, right? It certainly fits within our Catholic frame of mind. We want to encourage family. We want to encourage people to have children for the good of society, for the good of the home, et cetera. But these are not typical people who want to have typical children. These are people who want to have a certain kind of children. And they want to have children that are genetically superior to others and who they believe will be profitable citizens in society. After they became somewhat well known for this pronatalist movement, and they've been on many talk shows and in the news in various places, you can look them up and you'll see all kinds of things written about them. But they wanted to start another foundation that they call the Pragmatists Foundation. And with the Pragmatists Foundation, they wanted to promote what they called the next empire, in which they stated that they envisioned a city-state that would become a magnet for no-holds-barred medical research, which in turn would open the door to the mass production of genetically selected humans that they referred to as highly productive actors. So we can see here a real effort, similar really, there's something called negative eugenics, which is what we experience in this situation of Buck versus Bell, with Carrie Buck being sterilized and some 70,000 women as a consequence of that Supreme Court decision. That's a form of negative eugenics, but there's a kind of positive eugenics as well. And positive eugenics is when you work within the population like you would in agriculture. You would work within agriculture to develop the most productive crops, the ones that are the healthiest, the most vigorous, the ones that can withstand drought, even the ones that you can spray a field of corn with Roundup and it only kills the weed, it doesn't kill the corn, but the corn that you're eating has been genetically modified, right? So this is the sort of practice that these positive eugenicists are proposing. So within this pragmatist movement, then they were wanting to create a city-state government that would have incentive systems that would grant more voting power to creators of economically productive agents, and would be run by a single executor, which they proposed would be called, even use the word, dictator, with full control of the government's laws and operational structure. So this executor would be replaced every 3 years. And this executor, they said, could even be an AI, an artificial intelligence, wouldn't have to be a person. So this is the sort of thought that's out there. And we think, well, that sounds really fringy. And it doesn't really sound like it's something that could be too realistic or happen. Notice in the text here, it says that billionaires like Elon Musk want to save civilization by having tons of genetically superior children. It says in Business Insider. Elon Musk has, 11 children, maybe 12 children by now, with 3 different wives or partners, whatever they are. And his father, Elon Musk's father, which I understand he's not in great contact with as much as we as his mother. We see his mother often in the news with him. But his father is a self-proclaimed pronatalist and a positive eugenicist. He thinks we need to have children. We need to have the right children to perpetuate the species in the most productive and profitable way. So an individual's value in these people's mind is directly correlated to what that individual can provide to society. That's the human worth in the estimation of this movement. Individuals that can create the most to the state, to the society, and who can optimize the situations for life for themselves and for others. So someone found out about this private meeting and got the slide deck that they were using to promote this pragmatist foundation. And when Simone Collins heard about it, she said, I stand by all this 100%. There was no sort of backing away. They are perfectly upfront what their goals are. Simone ran for a House seat in Pennsylvania in the recent general election that we just had. And she actually took 42.7% of the vote in the area of the state of Pennsylvania that she was running to represent. So, these people might seem fringy, but these people are some of the primary movers and shakers in the world today. Simone and Malcolm Collins have been very successful in business. They're both highly achieved, highly productive people themselves, very successful, and they want to see a culture that's just like them. Elon Musk, and I don't want to, this is not a political conversation, but Elon Musk's news is often in the news. He said himself, the population is collapsing. The Earth's almost empty of humans, he wrote recently. So there's very much a concern on his part and others, and he's trying to do what he can to populate the Earth with the right kind of people. None of the children that these people are conceived naturally, and they're birthed naturally, but they're conceived through IVF and through polygenic risk screening, various other techniques that try to ensure that they have the most successful children that they can have. It's a little bit troubling. There was a conversation that came up within the Word on Fire communities that some of you may have been a part of a while back after now President-elect Trump's voiced his support for IVF and funding for IVF. And all of this happens, all of this positive eugenics happens. Without IVF, it could not happen because you need to make certain that you're having the right kind of embryos. This is a screenshot of the pronatalism.org website. You can go look at it yourself and you can see some of the techniques that they use. So they're very much in favor of egg and sperm donation and surrogacy to make certain that you're selecting for the best possible option of children genetically. And they're also, very much in favor of reproductive technology, what we call assisted reproductive technologies. And those involve things like polygenic risk screening that I just mentioned. They want to make certain that they screen for any possible so-called defects of the embryos so that no one gives life to a defective human person. So this is, by the way, these are screenshots from a couple of online catalogs where you can go so you can find what sort of egg donors and what sort of sperm donors that you want to make certain that you have the best possible options. You can see pictures of people so you get the right sort of visual effect, and you can see what their academic successes, what their business successes have been, both for women as egg donors and men as sperm donors. And this is a very expensive process, as you can imagine. So they even provide guarantees on each cohort of eggs. If you're spending upwards of $50,000 or $60,000 for rounds of IVF to conceive children and to store some frozen embryos within a cryopreservation container for the future, should you decide you want to have more children, you can have a guarantee on those embryos so that you don't lose your investment should they die. So, as I said, the total cost of a successful round of IVF can be upwards of $50,000 or $60,000. It involves using various drugs to stimulate the ovaries to produce more eggs, to aspirate those eggs, and then to obtain sperm from a donor or from a willing male partner, and mix and match in a lab, in a Petri dish in a lab, and then to go through something called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which can involve polygenic risk screening, which is a little controversial right now, to make sure that you're selecting the right embryos to implant in the womb. So big business these days, and it's a big business drawing a lot of money into it. As we can see from this information.com, this is the dawn of the Silicon Valley super baby. This was an article that appeared at this website, and you can read all about how we're working to manufacture And there's no other word for it because we're manufacturing products and we're taking the raw material of human gametes and mixing and matching to produce the kind of babies that we want to have. It's a pretty horrific procedure. So this, from the Heritage Foundation, most high-profile investors and users of Silicon Valley's fertility technology, however, are drawn for a different reason. Their primary goal is not to reverse the birth dearth of the United States. Their interest, to the tune of $800 million invested in fertility technology startups in 2022 alone, is the creation of genetically superior babies who are selected often out of a misguided compassion on the part of their parents based on their health, potential, creativity, or other characteristics. So if we think back to Asclepius in Plato's time, mythological demigod, of course, not a real person, but that was in Greek culture. They took that as words from him. If we bring that throughout human history and the way that babies that might have some sort of disability have been discarded, as we know, in various cultures over time, we bring that into our own world in the 1920s with the Buck versus Bell decision, and we see the tremendous amount of support that the American eugenics movement had around that period of time and the influence that it had on other parts of the world. We can see that the new eugenics that we have now in our own period of time is as threatening as any eugenics has been before us. Of course, all this is possible because of the research done by an Augustinian Catholic priest, Gregor Mendel, who was really the father of genetics, right? Of Mendelian genetics, anyway, which came to be named for him. I remember his experience from your high school biology or college classes where he was experimenting on genetically modifying peas and came up with dominant and recessive traits by crossing certain types of seeds. And through Mendel's principles of heredity, when they became applied to humans, then we could find that a recessive trait like alkaptonuria and albinism would be the result of a recessive gene manifesting itself, or dominant genetic disorders we could identify as these that you can see here: brachydactyly, congenital cataracts, Huntington's chorea, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, etc. So through the study of genetics, then, we could identify human traits that were the result of a mixture of genetic possibilities in human persons. And out of that, then, out of his research and out of an understanding of breeding in agriculture, genetically modifying organisms in agriculture, that could be applied to humans. And we have the British Eugenics Society in the 1930s. These are two promotional posters from the British Eugenics Society in the 1930s. One, only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. Very positive promotional piece by the British Eugenics Society in the early part of the 20th century. And then this on the right, release the strange hold of hereditary disease and unfitness. And we can see the unhealthy part being cut out at the root and not allowed to produce. And that was the eugenics movement in the early 1930s, largely driven in this country by Harry Laughlin and Charles Davenport, who Davenport originally was working in agriculture, obtained funding, some of them very prominent names in American philanthropy, like Rockefeller, Kellogg, and Carnegie, and others. And he found money to start a lab at Cold Spring Harbor, which I think is on Cape Cod, I think, and began experimenting with human genetics as well. So they founded what was called the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Springs Harbor in 1910, and they began to research human heredity and eugenics there. Harry Laughlin, rather, was another who worked within that lab, and Harry Laughlin eventually came to be highly regarded by the Germans, and the Germans borrowed much of their 1933 law for the prevention of hereditary defective offspring their so-called sterilization law, from the work of Harry Laughlin, who was also involved in the drafting of the Virginia statute that I mentioned earlier that was tried in the Supreme Court and resulted in the Buck versus Bell decision. So Laughlin was awarded an honorary degree by the University of Heidelberg in 1936 for his work on behalf of the science of racial cleansing. So this is very much a part of our history. And as I said, some of the major names in American philanthropy and business were involved: the John T. Rockefeller Foundation, George Eastman, President Woodrow Wilson, very much geneticist, especially when he was governor in New Jersey, working toward legislation that would try to purify the race there. And Margaret Sanger, of course, who's sort of the mother of Planned Parenthood, and others. So these efforts were supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, by the Carnegie Foundation, by the Ford Foundation, and others. And so this was sort of the thing here, the triangle of life. Your environment is what you're born into, it's what you have. Your education is what you can obtain or what you can do. Your heritage is what you are. So you can improve your education and even change your environment, but what you really are was all settled when your parents were born. Selected parents will have better children, and this is the great aim of eugenics. Selected parents, making sure that you have the right genetic material to bring into a union to produce the right kinds of children. So going from the 1930s to 2024 now, almost 100 years later, with people like the Collinses and their pronatalist movement, we can see where they have really honed this science down to a very, very fine art of being able to select very carefully the kinds of children that they think that should be had. So during the Nazi era, individuals were taken aside and noses were measured, bridges of their noses were measured, the ears, chin, all these different features were, and this is a literal picture from the Nazi racial cleansing initiatives, where a man's nose is being measured for its width to see how far from the right kind of person he was and to identify people so they could be eliminated. So when we come forward into the late 19th century, John Langdon Down essentially did the same thing. But you can imagine if in Germany, a person who they were being carefully analyzed and considered whether or not they should be fit to exist. We have people with Down syndrome. What do we do with people with Down syndrome? What do we do with people with other intellectual and developmental disabilities that people see as defects in the human condition? These people would not be welcome by the Collinses or by others involved in the pronatalist movement because they're seen as defective. They don't want defective individuals. They want units of production in society. People's worth is measured by their productivity. John Langdon Down in 1866 wrote a paper called Observations on an Ethnic Classification of Idiots. And again, the word is horrible. Idiots, imbeciles, all horrible words. We have to put them in the context of the time that they were used. We don't use those words anymore. We've gotten past that, thank goodness. But he identified a Mongolian type. He classified individuals based upon their characteristics. And he did the same sort of measurements and facial characteristics and whatever. Classified individual according to these characteristics. And he came up with what he called a Mongolian type that was characterized by a round face, oblique eyes, flat nape here, short bristly hair, thin eyebrows, a small pug nose, and thick cleaved tongue. John Langdon Down was believed then that this type was associated with individuals of Mongolian descent. So the word Mongolian or Mongol as applied to individuals with Down syndrome many, many years ago, no longer, we don't use these words, but we're talking about history. That's where this word Mongolianism came from. And it was John Langdon Down who Down syndrome came to be named for, working with individuals in the institution where he was in England and doing his research to try to understand what caused these various disabilities. And Langdon Down himself did wonderful things for individuals. From everything that we know of him, it was a pretty positive environment and the institution where he worked in England, but as we know later on, did not become the case. So that brings us to techniques that can be used now then to identify a situation that supports the work of people like the Collinses. Excuse me. And we have this situation of prenatal diagnosis. So what do we do about prenatal diagnosis? Because we know that prenatal diagnosis is highly associated with abortion. But what does it mean? You know, if we were taking a multiple choice test and we had this question, prenatal diagnosis as a tool for what? Is it knowing the sex of a child? So you know what color to paint the nursery or what color of clothes to ask for baby showers? Or is it to be used for discovering fetal anomalies? And if a fetal anomaly is present, to abort the child? Or is it to be used to discover that a child has a fetal anomaly, and if that anomaly is present, to be able to prepare, to be ready for the birth? Or you just don't know. The doctor recommended prenatal screening, so I'm doing prenatal screening, and we won't even think about it until we find that we have a result, a positive result from a prenatal diagnosis for some sort of intellectual or developmental disability. So prenatal diagnosis can be used for all of these things. Some people will go through the NIPT tests, and I've had women tell me this, yes, I had it because I wanted to know if we were having a girl or boy. And NIPT test is a non-invasive prenatal screening test. And it's a very simple blood test from a blood draw. They can find what's called cell-free DNA floating in the mother's blood, cast off from the placenta, and they can identify if there's some sort of a genetic anomaly for various things. And it's a growing list. Began with things like Down syndrome, trisomy 18, trisomy 13, Klinefelter syndrome, a small handful of others, and it's continuing to grow as they perfect the tests. But many people just want to know what sex a child is. Fine. But the big problem is here, right? Big problem is when prenatal diagnosis is used for the purpose of rejecting the child that's been given to the couple. And that's where it really starts to get kind of sticky and confusing. So all of this began here with this man. 5 points for all of you out there who can identify who it is. It's Dr. Jerome Lejeune. He was the French geneticist that discovered that Down syndrome wasn't Mongolism, as John Langdon Down has identified it back in 1866 in his paper, but that Down syndrome was actually caused by an additional copy of the 21st chromosome. And here's Jerome Lejeune working with something called a karyotype. And a karyotype was a technique that had been developed where you could tease out the DNA from the nucleus of a cell, and you could kind of plump it up with colchicine and then smash it apart, and then you'd have all that, and then take a picture of it all smashed out, and then you could sort the chromosomes. And we know that humans have 2 pairs of each of 23 chromosomes, right? So for a total of 46. And they're differentiated by size, although these look pretty similar, don't they? But they get smaller as you go down the list. And these chromosomes are where all our genes are, obviously, as I think everyone probably knows. But they come down way down here to the smallest. And we get to chromosome number 21, and there's a 3rd copy of chromosome 21. And that is what identifies what we still commonly call Down syndrome, or which is more medically appropriately called trisomy 21. Because there's an extra copy of the 21st chromosome. Another common condition is fairly common, but less common than trisomy 21, is trisomy 13 and trisomy 18, which trisomy 18 has an incredible survivability rate nowadays, much more than it used to. But these all result in various characteristics that we can identify and visually identify in the case of Down syndrome very clearly, as we talked about here, right? When we see someone with Down syndrome, we know that person has Down syndrome. Many people say that people with Down syndrome carry their diagnosis on their face. So HIPAA has no application there because you can't hide it. Not that anyone really wants to. But Jerome Lejeune changed the world with his understanding of how you could genetically identify an intellectual disability. This had happened about the same time that amniocentesis started to be used for certain identification purposes, taking a sample of the amniotic fluid and being able to identify in the amniotic fluid certain conditions as well. So all these things went together to be able to launch this field of prenatal diagnosis that has become very, very popular and advanced in a tremendous degree, even since I think 2000, when was the year? Maybe 2011, when this non-invasive prenatal screening techniques first emerged. I think it was 2011, I could be wrong. But there were various opinions of it around then. So this is Harry Harris in a book called Prenatal Diagnosis and Selective Abortion that was published in 1974. And let's, within context, Roe versus Wade was decided in 1973 in this country. France, a year before, I think 1972, the Veil laws were passed in France, in Jerome Legeune's home country, which allowed the termination of pregnancies, killing of children, frankly. So Harry Harris said this: to find out whether the fetus, he said, the new objective in medicine is this: to find out whether the fetus has some defined anomaly which will inevitably lead to the birth of a defective infant, and if so, to abort it. Harry Harris, 1974. And he wasn't supporting this necessarily. He was identifying this as a situation that was the result of being able to prenatally diagnose a disability with the legalization of abortion. It happened in this country then. Even worse, we come to 1990, and for those of you who are old enough to remember Joycelyn Elders, who became the Surgeon General, I think was her position under the Clinton administration, she said that abortion has had an important and positive public health effect because it has reduced the number of children afflicted with severe defects. To provide an example to support her claim, then she said, the number of Down syndrome infants in Washington state in 1976 was 64% lower than it would have been without legal abortion. So this was the Surgeon General of the United States making this comment in 1990. Time Magazine's Woman of the Year, supporting the eugenic purpose, the eugenic use of prenatal diagnosis to eliminate children with Down syndrome, and eventually we can broaden that out to other disabilities as well that could be seen. Some of you might have tuned into the conversation I had with Dr. Brian Skotko in our online communities several months ago now. I don't remember how long ago, but Dr. Brian Skotko is the director of the Down Syndrome Clinic at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, one of the leading researchers on sociological data, but also medical scientific data around Down syndrome. And he's done a great job at compiling statistics of the impact of prenatal diagnosis on the births of children with Down syndrome. So he said this in an interview that was published, and you can go to wordonfire.org and you can just search for Brian Skotko or search under my name, and you can find the interview if you're interested, that we published with Brian last year, 2023. But this was a quote from the interview that we did. We estimate that in recent years, there were 36% fewer babies with Down syndrome than could have been born in the US because of selective terminations. Annually in our country, this amounts to about 5,100 babies with Down syndrome being born and 3,900 fetuses with Down syndrome being selectively aborted. The reduction of babies with Down syndrome has steadily risen in Europe over the past 40 years to over 50% today, as high as 83% in Spain, 80% in Portugal, and 71% in Italy. New Zealand and Australia closely follow at 71% and 66% respectively. So we found that abortion coverage for Down syndrome diagnosis was covered fully by government funding in 52.4% of countries in 1990, and that number increased to 73.8% in 2021. So if we go back to Harry Harris's comment about this new objective in medicine being created by the discovery of prenatal diagnosis, leading to the abortion of what was called a defective infant. If we think of what Joycelyn Elders said, that in 1976, there was 64% lower, the births of children with Down syndrome was 64% lower than it would have been without legal abortion. We can see the impact of what prenatal diagnosis has had on the births of children But it's not over. Prenatal diagnosis, as I said, becomes more and more sophisticated. This is an article that appeared in the International Journal of General Medicine. Granted, it was written by Chinese investigators and coming from a different culture and a different understanding than we have. Christianity is informing the culture, as if Christianity is informing our culture. Maybe it's on an upswing again, but we know where that stands for those of the United States. But what this paper was written for is to show how doing what's called a chromosomal microarray analysis can provide for a fetus that was found to have some sort of abnormality through ultrasound. So what this is advocating for is taking the results of an ultrasound test and then using this chromosomal microarray analysis. So you can do a sequencing of the genetic material of the fetus, and you can compare that to a database of other typical children's genetic material, and you can identify from that the anomalies that appear. And this is saying that through that, you can discover a lot of reasons that there might be. You can confirm an anomaly that might appear on an ultrasound. So, and it's talking about, if I can find it here, this doesn't have the highlighted. It says it is an important method for prenatal screening of fetal malformations and plays an important role in the prevention and treatment of birth defects. So the only way you can prevent a birth defect is if you kill the child. You can't prevent a child who has a genetic anomaly. In rare cases, you can do something to do an intrauterine surgery, as we know these days, and repair some things. But in many cases, you can't. And this article also talks about the incidence of birth defects in China is about 5.6%. It brings a huge burden to both the family and to society. So it's talking about the burden that's brought to the family and society through having defective infants. And it's talking about the positive benefit of being able to eliminate those births through using increasingly advanced techniques of identifying anomalies in preborn children. So what do we think about prenatal screening? You know, we can go back to that test, the 4 questions. If you want to find out the sex of a child, fine, not a problem. If you want to find out if your child should show in prenatal screening and diagnostic testing that there is some sort of fetal anomaly, which is a technical language for something like Down syndrome or whatever, so that you can prepare for the birth, great, because there's always a bit of a grieving process that happens when you realize that you're going to have a child that isn't the child that you expected to have. So great, all in favor of it. If you're just going through the process because your OBGYN said that you should, well, then your OBGYN didn't do what they're supposed to do in truly informing you and consenting you on that procedure. You have the right to, you by law, I think, required to be fully consented before you consent to any medical procedure, which means you're told what the consequences of it might be. If you're having prenatal screening with the intention of aborting a child should it prove defective, then the church forbids that. The church doesn't prohibit prenatal screening, perfectly accepting of it, unless it's being used to identify a condition that you refuse to live with, and therefore you would be using that information to terminate the birth of the child. So the big question then for us at the end of this is, how do we protect life in a culture that's obsessed with perfection? Feel free to send your comments and type your comments and your ideas. We'd love to see them. So how do we deal with this? Because it's not going away. Abortion is not going away. Even after the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, the actual number of abortions increased. And I just saw a horrific data point the other day that said about half the number of abortions in the United States now are chemically induced abortions. And a lot of those are DIY, do-it-yourself abortions at home. You go home and you take a pill and you wait for the pill to have its effect and you miscarry the child if you're early enough. And a lot of those aren't recorded in the statistics. So, in those situations, most people wouldn't know if they have a child with any sort of birth anomaly or not, but nonetheless, there are abortions still. But what do we do then when we're faced with a culture that has the capability of selecting against things like Down syndrome or trisomy 18 or Klinefelters or whatever it might be? And increasingly, we have a growing population of individuals with autism, and they're more and more beginning to understand that there are some genetic markers for autism and some interesting research that's being done. What happens then when we can find genetic markers for autism and identify those prenatally? What decisions then are going to be made? So how do we work within our culture to overcome this? It's a really big question. I think one thing that we have to do is provide good information. And I said that if a woman is being encouraged by her OBGYN to go through prenatal screening, you're not required to do it. It's something that the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists recommends for all pregnant women, not only women now that fit a certain risk profile, like older mothers who have a higher incidence of giving birth to children with Down syndrome, for example. Now, ACOG, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, is recommending that all women, regardless of their age or risk profile, go through some prenatal screening. But are you being told why? And what we hear anecdotally is in many cases, no. It's just a part of the routine stuff you do. You have your ultrasounds. And it used to be they did these screening tests, like a quad screen, that they would check for certain proteins that would be markers. I think now pretty much most of that's being done with this new technology called non-invasive prenatal screening. Again, simple blood tests, the results are back. It doesn't give you a diagnosis. It only provides a probability to you. And that probability needs to be well defined and well explained. And there are a lot of physicians themselves who don't understand the tests well enough from what the physicians even say themselves. They don't understand the results of the test well enough to be able to explain them to their patients. So one thing that can be done is we can work for laws that require people to receive good information when they do receive a positive diagnosis for something like Down syndrome. We got one of these passed in my home state of Pennsylvania a few years ago with great work by a man named Kurt Kondrick that lives in the Pittsburgh area. Has a daughter, Chloe, with Down syndrome, and they really worked to get this law passed in Pennsylvania. So it's like a Down Syndrome Education Act. It's when someone receives a positive diagnosis of Down syndrome, they have to have fair, balanced, accurate, up-to-date information on what that means. Not just the bad news, but all the good news that comes along with it as well. And legislation like that has been passed in other states as well. If your state doesn't have one, encourage it. Encourage it. Parishes should always have resources, I think, for women. I believe that this should always be a part of marriage prep. We assume in our Catholic tradition, marriage is unitive and procreative, and the marriage vows involve the willingness to accept children lovingly from God. And I think it would be appropriate in marriage preparation classes even to have something that talks about the variety of possibilities in having children. Father of a son with Down syndrome, I'm all for it. Families need to know that it's not the end of the world. In a culture that is increasingly pressuring people for perfection, families need to know the beauty of having children with disabilities and the beauty and the diversity of humanity that those individuals represent and provide for us. So parishes should have resources, whether it's in marriage prep. There should also be resources in parishes for families that have received a prenatal diagnosis of some sort of fetal anomaly that might be coming, and be put in contact with good information like through Be Not Afraid or other organizations that would support individuals that receive a prenatal diagnosis. So all of these things can be done. All of these things can be done to help protect life in our Catholic world and beyond. If we're talking about education being required for families that receive a prenatal diagnosis before any decision of what to do might be. Doctors should be neutral, but in many cases we hear they're not. Many doctors, well, whether they're true or not, I've even heard stories of doctors even scheduling abortions for women after they receive a prenatal diagnosis and they have to turn them down, which I hope that's not true, but maybe it is. I don't know. So these are the threats that we're facing on this front with the advancing medical technology that exists and with the advancing attitude within a culture that wants perfection in cases like the pronatalist movement, where they want to repopulate the earth. Good goal, but in the wrong kind of way, through Gattaca style development of the race by selecting the right sort of embryos that will grow into human beings that families think will have the right sort of intelligence, aptitudes that will bring a positive benefit to society. So these are things I think we should think about as we move forward and we talk about these issues. We're talking about threats to the disabled. This is probably this is the life and death threat to the disabled here. This is the life and death threat. And we need to inform our families, raise children, work within our parishes and our churches to help families understand this threat, especially families who are young and in their childbearing years. So we'd love to have your questions and your comments. So do we have anything coming in that we can?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Just to reiterate what Mark said, if you do have any questions, especially for those who are watching on YouTube, if you haven't had a chance to type in your questions, please feel free to do so. We have had a number of questions. I think the first one I would like to start with, just to kind of situate our discussion, is, we've heard a lot about the scientific developments and the ability we have really to diagnose some of these issues, some of the challenges, so that we can be informed. How can we really bring our Catholic faith to bear into these issues? In other words, there are some things that are true about what we've been hearing and that comport with our Catholic faith, and then there's some that don't. And so how can we draw out the good aspects, for example, having children,
right,
while also correcting those aspects that that don't comport with our Catholic faith? In other words, how do we exercise that discernment as Catholics? And then how can we evangelize perhaps our family, friends, and others to help them to see the fullness of the truth about life?
Yes, great question. I mentioned marriage prep. I think there's a lot of great things being done in marriage prep around the country in a lot of areas. But I think really reinforcing how we understand marriage and family in our Catholic tradition, marriage is unitive and procreative. That's just what marriage is for. And if we're going into a marriage, understanding that a marriage means children, it doesn't mean building your career. It means that you have children because that's what marriage and family is. Then we have to move to the next step of understanding that any child that God gives us is God's gift to us, and it's not something that we're selecting for ourselves. And I think, in our culture, it's sad to say, but I think children are seen more and more as kind of a commodity because we have so many choices now. We have them when we want to. We have them when it's convenient. We give them the best of everything we can possibly do. And in the case of the situation of the use of what I'm talking about here with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and selecting only the best embryos to implant to give birth to children, we're building an understanding of children as something other than what they're intended to be. And marriage is a school of love, right? It's a school of love. If a man and woman should get married and find that they can't have children, it's still a school of love. And the more children you have, the more that you come to understand the beauty of just a natural diversity within humanity, because all of our children are different. We had 7, you have 7, number 8's on the way. I was with a family yesterday with 5, all unique and individual persons. And we just need to find a way to restore our understanding of the beauty of that diversity, and then bring into that diversity the beauty of what disability can provide. And that's through exposure. There are people in our parishes with disabilities. There are 2 to 3% of the population has intellectual disability. And a lot of those people are in our parishes or developmental disability. More and more, 1 in 36 children at 8 years old, now this statistic have been diagnosed with autism. So more and more individuals in our parishes are having disabilities. We need to welcome them in, we need to see them, we need to appreciate them and love them. And love is an act of the will. It's something that we have to overcome. When we're talking about coming to love individuals with disabilities, there's a lot that we have to overcome in terms of our fears, our judgments, our understandings of humanity. And those are all positive lessons that God wants us to learn. We can't get away from this topic, though, without talking about IVF and in vitro fertilization, because when we're talking about this pronatalist movement, it's not possible without this technology. And the church flatly condemns in vitro fertilization. There is no place for it. Some people, and we were having this discussion online, as I mentioned, after President Trump made these comments about supporting IVF. I wrote an article on evangelization and culture online. My colleague Richard DeClue did the same, and we had some sort of offline conversations about that as well, because and I was talking with a friend of mine who's John Haas, the former president of the National Catholic Bioethics Center, about the same thing. And it's amazing the number of Catholic people who do not understand that IVF is an evil. It's something that is not permissible within the Catholic Church, within Catholic teaching. And many people don't understand that, because life is a good, and we want to have children. We encourage children. We encourage big families. And after all, isn't IVF life-giving? Well, IVF is largely death-dealing, because for every embryo that's implanted, there are often many who are not and are either destroyed or will eventually die over time as they languish away in cryopreservation tanks and storage facilities. But even as some people use the example, you can take one egg that you aspirate from a woman's ovary. You can take sperm aspirated from a testicle. You don't have to obtain sperm through masturbation. Sorry to be crude, but that's the reality of it when we're talking about IVF. That itself is intrinsically evil. So maybe you can legitimately bring 2 gametes together without doing some sort of explicitly morally objectionable act. But you still are depriving that child of the beauty of the union of 2 people coming together in the marital embrace to give themselves completely and totally to one another in the possible engendering of children. And that's where the model of the Trinity is in the family, right? We see this beautiful model of the Trinity, as Bishop Barron tells us all the time. We have the Father and the Son, and the love that they have for one another engenders the life of the Holy Spirit among us and brings us the love that's communicated from the both. That's the family. And IVF takes that out of the process, and it risks making children a commodity. And when children become a commodity, they don't become something that we just willingly accept as God's gift for ourselves. So we have to reinforce those beliefs that we have, but in many cases have been forgotten or just overlooked or misunderstood.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. We have a couple of folks from our Word on Fire platform who ask similar questions. They inquire, what books do you recommend to learn more about the new eugenics or DNA historical studies, or the websites that you recommend for further learning and formation on this topic?
Yeah, I'm not prepared to answer that one. I think, the research is changing quickly. Online is the best resource these days to get a lot of the information. So if you just, go to pronatalism.org and just read what they're up to there at pronatalism.org and see, and then read couple of documents that are very valuable, I think. One is Donum Vitae from what used to be called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and talks about things like IVF and surrogacy and all these different issues. So those are really valuable. Go to the Catechism. Those are very valuable resources to understand what the Church teaches on these issues. And probably I would say go there and read that before you go to pronatalist.org, because with that information, then you can go out into some of these other areas, into the wilderness of the research that's being done, and understand what's happening. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question. Michael asks, how do we protect our disabled brothers and sisters in Christ against euthanasia and assisted suicide in Canada and Europe? The disabled are being pressured to kill themselves by assisted suicide, or even killed by euthanasia, or even denied treatment. So obviously we've been talking more about the beginning of life, but here looking to the end of life. How, as Catholics, can we support our brothers and sisters in Christ in this way?
We'll be talking about this on day 3 when I talk about the mental health crisis and how that's impacting people with disabilities. And in that talk, I'll be referencing what Kingston University in England discovered when they were analyzing the data from requests for euthanasia in the Netherlands, and how many of those people had some with autism, others with intellectual disabilities, and the reasons they were requesting so-called assisted dying these days, although euthanasia is legal there as well. It's not just physician-assisted suicide. They will kill you. You don't have to be given something to kill yourself. So we'll talk about some of those things. Tune in on day 3. But how can we protect them? Well, we have to protect them from despair. We have to protect them from the loneliness that leads to the despair that would cause someone to want to make that choice for themselves. I've been having a difficult conversation with a friend of mine. Doesn't live in this country. She lives in Paris. She's a single mom and has a child with Down syndrome. She's not a Catholic, but she has a good friend who is, I think she was an author. This woman is an author and journalist. And she has very severe MS and has very little control of her body and just wishes she could die. And I think, there's a certain, so how do we protect people who are in that situation? Well, as I keep trying to tell this friend of mine, that person needs to understand that their life, even in the shape that their life is still a gift. And I said, she's a gift to you, this friend of mine, because she's evoking from her a love and a compassion that probably wouldn't be there otherwise. But we have to express that to people. Loneliness is a horrible situation for people who are disabled, whether it's physical disabilities or intellectual disabilities or development disability. The loneliness and isolation, most of them report that they have no friends outside of their family or caregivers, people who are being paid to take care of them. Those are their friends. So we have to break through that. We have to provide community for people, and we have to fight against laws that would encourage it. So far, compulsory euthanasia, there are various ways that things can seem to be compulsory. In Denmark, they set a goal that by some year, I don't remember now what it was, they would be Down syndrome free. They're requiring all women, or providing all women now, to receive prenatal screening, but the culture around them is hostile to disability. And in the case of Down syndrome, the number of Down syndrome individuals in the country is dwindling, so services are fewer. So there's a way that there may not be compulsory euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, but a culture can develop around that almost makes it seem that way. We can't let that culture happen. The only culture that we can really control is the culture of our homes. And within our homes, we have to stress the value of life. We have to raise our children to understand the value of life. We have to be optimistic and not pessimistic for the culture that's ahead of us and the life that's ahead for them, because children are despairing. Children are ending their lives. We know we have an epidemic of suicided young men in this country, largely because of the despairs that they're seeing around them. We can't let that despair overtake our homes when we look at the world and we see wars taking place everywhere, where I mentioned at the beginning of this, the situation now in Syria. We can't let those situations come to despair. We always have to know Jesus won the victory already. He's triumphed over death already. We're playing out the roles here. We're playing it out to the end, knowing that the good news has already been given to us, and that's where our hope is. We have to be joyful in that and optimistic in that, and not allow our families to fall into despair, our children, and then just bring that out to the next level, to the parish. Create situations in parish where people with disabilities are cared for and welcomed, where they're given things to do, where they can feel that there's some value in their lives, and they won't want that. They won't want that.
Thank you very much for that. You mentioned earlier that, and I can't remember the exact context, this idea that the individual value is directly correlated to his or her value to the state. And I wondered if you could comment a little bit upon how our Catholic understanding really differs from that, in the sense that our value is intrinsic to us, made in the image and likeness of God. And how can we inculcate this? You talked a lot about the family as the first place where this is happening, but how can we proclaim Christ in a culture that sees a person's value based on their value to the state, as a means to an end rather than an end unto itself?
Yeah. Well, I think, the document that came out from the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith a few months back, Dignitas Infinita, I think it was called, sort of struck some new categories that we haven't understood human dignity within. It talked about an ontological dignity, and that's what we always would refer to as a dignity that we have being created in the image of God, which is something that we can understand. But there were a couple of other categories, and off the top, I didn't prepare this, so off the top of my head, I can't recall what they were now, but they like a social dignity or something. That wasn't what it was called, but something similar to that. It was a dignity that's almost given to the individual or evoked by the individual circumstances. So if someone's living in poverty, someone's living on the street, someone is living with a disability, someone doesn't have control of their body, all of those things other individuals can see as taking away from the dignity of that individual. This friend of my friends that I mentioned, who has serious difficulty with MS, people would look at her life and say it has no dignity, maybe because of the circumstances she's been forced to live in. But we have to try to always look past the circumstances. When you see people on the street, or, dirty, smelly, or we see people with disabilities that have very little control, or even something as simple as being at Mass and a family has a child with autism who starts spinning during Mass and they start flapping and making sounds. We embrace that, we accept that, and we don't fear that or run away from it. We embrace it. And, everything starts small and grows out from us. The only person ultimately we have control of is ourselves and our attitudes, and then our families, and that helps inform the world around us and our culture and our society more broadly. So we just have to go back to, understand that, yes, our human dignity is inherent in each one of us. It's God's gift to us as being created in his image. But we can, if we allow ourselves, see people's dignity as being compromised by their circumstances and remove the circumstances that result in that compromise.
Thank you. You spoke earlier about the Nazis' ideology of eugenics, and we could talk about how this ideology has made its way up to our present through Margaret Sanger and others. Can you help us contextualize this within our understanding of this obsession, as you put it, with perfectibility? Where is this coming from, right? And how does Christ provide the answer, to that question, right? That perfectibility isn't something that we bring about, but that is something that ultimately Christ is doing in us and through us. We're called to perfection, right? But it's a perfection that God is working within us rather than something that we're doing. So can you speak just a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is, as I pointed out at the beginning, this is ancient, this belief that only people who can contribute positively to society are are worthy of society. And we can see with the coming of Christ the transformation that happened in the Roman Empire, right? Almost from the beginning and his teaching. We were just talking before, a quote from Archbishop Chaput that I read the other day. For those of you who look at the pillar or read the pillar, Archbishop Chaput, and I've been close to saying things like this before, but I've been hesitant because it seems very blunt, but Archbishop Chaput was a master of bluntness to make his point. Great, great man. He was our Archbishop in Philadelphia and privileged to know him a bit. But he made the comment that if you don't care for the poor, you're going to hell. Just very blatantly said it. And how many times can we see in the scripture that's true? You know, read the story of the rich man and Lazarus, for example. Striking example, the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man we call Dives because he was wealthy. Not good news for that guy who didn't give Lazarus anything from his table, right? And we can see other instances in scripture where we're called to reach out and to embrace and to bring in people that society has rejected. But how well do we do that in the church? I think it's a huge failing. Why is it a failing? Because it moves us beyond our comfort level, right? We have a very developed culture, a very developed society in all material ways. We're prosperous, you know, we're here in this beautiful studio with all this equipment, and we've had great opportunities for education and experiences in life. And we come to value those things, and we want to be around people that we share those things with. So those are the people that we gather in. We gather in the people who are like us. And that's just a natural tendency within humanity. But we know by the words that Jesus has told us that that's the wrong tendency. We have to fight against that tendency within ourselves. But I think that tendency has not been resisted in history. The natural tendency to embrace our own, to value human achievement, to value intellect, to value strength. Look at, in my last seminar, I talked about the things that we value. The last seminar I did here, I talked about, you know, we value the, I mean, look at this, what's the singer's name who's so popular? Who, you know, like hugely popular, like she's bringing in billions of dollars in her tour. Oh, Taylor Swift, thanks. So, you know, look at what people will do for a Taylor Swift concert, for a ticket to a Taylor Swift concert. Athletes, look at how they're prized and the salaries that they bring in. Actors, look how much power they think they have over our culture, and how when the candidate that they support doesn't win an election, they're all put out, and some of them are leaving the country because they just don't think they're valued anymore here. You know, look at the ridiculousness around all of that, and look at the wisdom of Christ. Look at the wisdom of Christ. Reject all of that. Reject it. Bring in the people who are at the margins. Bring in the poor. You know, bring in the needy. Bring in the deformed. Bring in those who are impaired in any kind of way. Bring them in and welcome them as your brothers and sisters. Reject what the culture has. That was the transformation that Christ brought to the culture at his time, that the apostles took out to the world and began to transfer the world, transform the world around them. It's the message of Christ. And where the message of Christ is absent in the culture, we can see what's happened. There was a new article that was published probably a year, maybe a little more year ago, called The New Paganism, I think it was. Maybe it was in First Things or something, maybe First Things. But anyway, it's exactly that. Look what's happening. We're losing Christ in the culture. The Christian voice has been diminished substantially in the culture. And look what's happening. As a Christian voice diminishes in the culture, assisted suicide, abortion, the transgender ideology, all of these distortions of God's glorious creation in the human person are being distorted and destroyed for some false, ridiculous desire, impulse that is at the most base nature of what we've become after the fall. It's Christ is the only one that can perfect us and draw us out of that and draw us into himself and create a better world. There's no utopia here. We're not talking about utopia. We're talking about bringing the kingdom. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. God's will is done in heaven. There's peace, there's harmony, There's a consonance that the ancients believed was woven all throughout the creation of the universe, because it was. They had it right. We have to bring ourselves into consonance with his will, And that's the only way to solve these issues.
Amen. Well, thank you, Mark. To be continued. For those of you watching on the Word on Fire Institute platform, we will see you again tomorrow and Wednesday as we continue our conversation. For those of you joining on YouTube, I hope you will go to institute.wordonfire.org right now to sign up to become an Institute member. You can sign up for a free 30-day trial, catch all of the seminars we've already done, explore our online courses, and join our many communities. Please join us in this conversation. I hope to see you there. We'll be back here tomorrow, right here in Rochester. See you then, and God bless you.